I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Mayadeen Television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen Television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, for Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, but discussing Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United States, the crisis over the murder of the Iranian scientist. Dr Mohsen Fakhrizadeh and several others were cruelly murdered in the street just outside Tehran last month. What did it all mean? How did it all happen? How was it allowed to happen? And what will be the consequences of it? The proximate reason for the attempt to nobble Iran's peaceful nuclear program by one means or another, by crippling sanctions, strangling sanctions, sanctions that are literally killing people or actually killing them on the streets. What are the reasons for this? The stated reason is that Iran will not be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapon. Iran says it has no intention of acquiring a nuclear weapon, though if you ask me, they probably ought to and already have ought to. They are surrounded by enemies which are bristling with nuclear weapons. The United States fleet, the British fleet, and of course, Israel itself. No one any longer pretends that Israel is not involved in a campaign of murder against Iranian scientists. No one in their right mind imagines that the sophisticated murder operation against Dr. Fakhrizadeh was not organized and possibly even carried out by Israel. And he was not the first Iranian scientist to be murdered by them. And I suspect he will not be the last. Israel, of course, has a mountain of nuclear weapons, literally hundreds of nuclear weapons pointed at all of its neighbors. It holds these nuclear weapons entirely in secret, entirely illegally, outside the framework of the IAEA, outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and of course, unlike Iran, it doesn't allow anyone to inspect its facilities. We know this because of the brave Jewish whistleblower, Mordechai Vanunu, who escaped from Dimona, where he had been working, came to London and told the English newspapers about the then, and that's almost a quarter of a century ago, 220 Israeli nuclear weapons. So let me get this right. The United States and Israel, who have a mountain of nuclear weapons, are murdering people in the streets of Iran to stop them acquiring a single nuclear weapon, even though there is no evidence at all that they are trying to build one. You might say all of this is difficult to believe. But there was a secret meeting in Saudi Arabia not even 1 week before the murder of Dr. Mohsen. We know for sure that the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, was at the meeting. We know that Mike Pompeo, the character from The Sopranos, doubling as the Secretary of State of the United States, was also there. The Israeli press tells us that Benjamin Netanyahu was the third leg on the stool, that he was also present. If true, and Saudi Arabia denies it, it's hard to believe that this murder was not on the agenda. It's hard to believe that this murder was not at least informed to the people at the meeting, if not a green light for the operation taken. Iran has not retaliated, as it did not severely retaliate over the earlier murder of the Iranian general. General Soleimani was as big and important a figure in Iran as Dr. Mohsen, possibly more so. Iran's retaliation was to some extent stage managed. It did not go beyond certain limits. There has been no retaliation yet for the murder of Dr. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. But I feel sure that there will be, and I feel sure that there was intended to be. I feel sure that the United States and Israel are deliberately seeking to lure Iran into a retaliatory military response so that they can respond to the response. And in the fog of war, no one will remember, especially through the fog of Western media, no one will remember who started the shooting in the first place. That's my take. As always, I'm joined by guests of great eminence, experts, and let's hear their take on why Israel is allowed to murder scientists in the Middle East. Dr. Yasmin Mather of St. Anthony's College, Oxford University, an editor, commentator of great note. Thank you for joining us. You heard my introduction. Do you take issue with any of it? And what would you like to add?
I don't take any issue with it. Israel has denied for many years that it has nuclear weapons. We all know that's not true. In addition to what you've said, there are a number of people seeking compensation for nuclear radiation illness caused by nuclear plants in Israel. We know this because the Israeli press has reported their cases. I think that we are in a very strange time when if such an act had been done by an Arab country, by a third world country, anywhere in the world, imagine a US scientist, a European scientist had been killed in the streets of London or Paris. Over the last 3 weeks, we would have had no end of publicity. We would have had lectures about how these people in Arab countries, these Muslims, don't know the rule of law, international law. They are ignorant. They are barbaric.
The rules-based order.
The rules-based order. They don't understand civilization. Yeah? And we have almost heard only murmurs about what happened in the streets of Tehran. I'm personally opposed to nuclear weapons anywhere. But the first step to a nuclear-free Middle East is for Israel to give up its nuclear weapons. That would be the first demand, because it's the countries that we all know has nuclear weapons. My own judgment is that Iran hasn't got nuclear weapons, but it is developing to the stage where it can go there. My belief is it's called the Japan syndrome, where you build nuclear weapons to a certain level, but don't actually acquire nuclear weapons. Japan's then passed this at some stage, but for many years it was going.
So you have the technology, but you don't weaponize it.
Exactly. You have the capability, but you don't weaponize it. But obviously, nuclear weapons will destroy the entire region and will destroy Europe if you use them. So we should campaign for a non-nuclear Middle East. But as I said, the first step, if anyone is serious about such a call, is to ask for the destruction of nuclear weapons in the state of Israel.
What do you think of the Saudi angle? If this meeting did take place, the Saudis deny it, the Israeli media insists upon it, and they have produced, I must say, some quite convincing flight paths and so on of Netanyahu's jet. Is it likely that this matter was discussed between the three parties at that meeting?
It could have been. However, maybe the planning for this required a longer time.
Sure.
I don't know. maybe the final approval for putting into action a plan that had been planned for many months was given then. In terms of Netanyahu being there, one of his ministers proudly said he was there. So we have a member of Likud party confirming that Netanyahu was at that meeting. My guess is he was there. And yes, you are right. It could be that the approval and the actually putting into action a plan that required months of planning, I would have thought, came that months.
This would represent, it's only a thesis that you and I share, but this would represent a shifting of the tectonic plates in the region, wouldn't it?
It would, yes, because at least so far, Saudi Arabia keeps denying this and therefore, and hasn't gone to the bilateral relations that Israel has had with Bahrain, with United Arab Emirates. And given the change of guards in the US, the future of bin Salman is hindered. I'm not saying he will lose power, but his future is hindered during a Biden presidency, not because Democrats have very moral principles more than Trump did, but because on appearance, Biden administration will have a different take on bin Salman.
Speaking of Bahrain, Ali Al-Fayez, a Bahraini citizen in exile, political activist, commentator on both Middle East and military affairs. Particularly glad you could join us. What's your take on the assassination of Dr. Mohsen?
Thanks, George. I suppose we should go to the principle of the creation of the Zionist entity, Israel. The colonial power who have left Middle East, they wanted to continue the control of the wealth and the political in that area. And after the Second World War, they started to withdraw, but they needed somebody to act as a proxy or an agent. That's why they created Israel in the 40s, and they gave the promise here in Britain and London. The idea is to disable these countries from producing knowledge and science. So they rely on the Western power totally. And the Western power can milk their wealth and control the area remotely through Israel. So if we have an independent country like Iran who produced the knowledge and came to a stage where they are able to use a nuclear technology to produce energy, medicine, and so on and so forth, is against the, their project, is against their idea. So it is natural that Israel, United States, and other Western power will target the scientists in Iran and others, like what they did in Jordan and Egypt and other countries as well.
And in Iraq also.
And in Iraq. Now, the idea is to either disable Iran or to stop it from developing its capabilities of using, nuclear technology. Because it's not about the nuclear weapon, because that's haram. By Imam Khamenei said openly, it's haram, it's prohibited by Islam. We are not allowed to use such weapon in Islam. It's about the technology itself. It's about Iran being able to produce knowledge and science, Iran being able to be an independent country and to transfer this knowledge to other countries. Then the Western will lose grip on that area and will lose a grip on its wealth.
The project that you describe is working rather well, one has to say. Another Arab country surrendered to Israel and openly normalized its relations. many of these, all of these countries already had secret relations, but now they are proudly married. In the case of Morocco, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, an Emirati prince has just bought a 50% stake in an Israeli football club, and so on. This is a festival of normalization. So why the need to, if the project is working as well as it is, why the need to go to the extreme of risking a regional war? Because Iran will and has the capability of fighting back.
Let's look at this festival of marriage that's happening between the Zionist entity and the Arab world. The government who have proudly announced their marriage with Israel are a government who have been created by the colonial power. Bahrain, UAE, Moroccan, Saudi on the way. Sudan was somehow blackmailed, and they are not government elected by the people. At a point of time, the people will revolt and change the political atmosphere. And what encouraged them is an independent country in Middle East who have been under a severe restrictions, boycott by American and Western power, which is Iran, who managed to resist, survive, produce, and prosper it for the 40 years. So the youth in the Arab world will look at Iran as an example to revolt and build their countries. That's why this marriage is not enough. They have to destroy the capabilities of Iran or disable it or put it under severe restrictions.
Very interesting. The third of our excellent guests is Musharraf Hosseini, an Islamic scholar, political activist, director of Justice for Peace. Let me get this one out of the way. Are nuclear weapons haram or merely, what's the word, makruh? They're not approved of, but they're not forbidden. Maybe the use of them would be haram, but the possession of them, I'm not a scholar, you are, it would seem to me not haram when someone else is threatening you with their nuclear weapons.
You know, if a thing is haram to use, so keeping that, I don't think that will be a good idea to keep them and produce them if you're not going to use them. But secondly, the world, the materialistic powers, they definitely believe in 2 and 2 makes 4. So they say that if they don't have the nuclear weapons, they don't want to clear. I think Iran doesn't want to clarify that we don't want to have nuclear technology and capability. If they clear it, same thing is going to happen. They tried it with Saddam. You have got here, oh, come and see it, we don't have. Here. The last thing they searched was the presidential palace. And when they were sure that they are not going to, he doesn't possess any type of weapons, the next thing was Desert Storm.
Attack.
Yeah, attack, Desert Storm, and all those storms came in. So Iran, I think they are very intelligent to not to make that situation, and they are not. They say it is haram. It is haram to have those weapons, and to kill en masse people and population and human beings is obviously haram without a reason. You can't kill. Killing one person is like killing the whole humanity.
Yes, I mean, the issue is that nuclear weapons are unlimited in space and time. In other words, you can fire them at a target, but it will affect everyone, and it will not just affect them there and then, but for
future
decades afterwards. That's what renders them qualitatively different from, if you like, normal weapons, isn't it?
This is one of the reasons. But then the destruction is far beyond just killing the people. It's the destruction of the land, environment, and everything is involved. And for the future generations also, if these weapons are used, we can destroy the earth many times. And we have so far not come to the conclusion that there is any other living being on other planets. They might be, but we haven't come to the conclusion yet. We haven't found. So we are lonely in this universe presently. So to destroy this planet and destroy this universe is not a good idea. And nobody should be possessing the nuclear weapons and having the capability of destroying the world and the earth and the human race as overall. But the thing is that the powerhouse of controlling the world, it has got army, air force, navy, and then we have got nuclear weapons, we have got biological weapons, we have got chemical weapons.
Space weapons.
Now space is being utilized. They are trying to grab control of the moon and the space to fight on this small planet Earth, and the only living human race here on the Earth. It's a destructive idea. And they are out of control. They just want to control everything. This is one point. George, I would like to make another point, that if we see in the wider spectrum, the world is on the brink of breaking. The world system, world order is on the brink of collapse. And they know that whosoever is able to control the world at this moment, they will be able to control the whole world for the next 100 years, at least a century or more than that. So they are rushing that no other power except their proxies or their one who are under their control, they should come forward. Iran is something who is bringing in new political ideas, new systematic ideas. It's a new system. It's not controlled by the materialistic world and their system. It's something a different voice. And this different voice will encourage the people, as our brother said. These governments are no doubt, these are the proxies. After the First World War and the Second World War, they have been created, lines have been drawn. This is Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and all these lines drawn. These are something unnatural countries. They be looking after their culture and everything. They've been created as proxies. But now, whatever we are heading to, the new system, these countries, their rulers don't have any standing in their public. They are not democracies. They haven't been going to the public and asking them or support of the public. So this is just the governments which are in control. They are with the Americans and with the Israel and with all those. They can, and this marriage, the normalization, I don't call it a normalization. This is a surrender. This is, in fact, everybody, they are trying, the United States is in reality trying its best to make everyone surrender to Israel now at this moment, because Israel, they think they are in our control, or America is under the control of the Zionist lobbies and all that stuff. So at this moment, they want that all these countries should submit or surrender to Israel in the present situation. But the governments might surrender, and they might have surrendered for a long time ago. But the public, I don't think they will.
Well, we'll see. Not much sign of dissent, certainly in the Gulf. I'm a bit surprised with Morocco, which has mass political organizations, it has civil society, it has trade unions and communists and all kind of ists. We'll see how quietly the Moroccan people go into that good night. Much more of this coming up after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, here in London for Mayadeen Television, but discussing the crisis provoked by the assassination, the latest assassination of yet another Iranian scientist. My panel of distinguished experts have spoken. Let's go to Iran, to Tehran, and talk with Dr. Syed Mohammed Marandi, who is an academic and political analyst, a professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. Doctor, why does Israel have such hatred towards Iran?
Well, the Israeli regime has a deep animosity towards Iran simply because Iran is the only major country in the world that doesn't recognize the Israeli regime. We have to remember that the Saudis, they have a secret relationship with Israelis. They've had it for a long time. The Turkish government, they have a embassy, they have direct flights and trade, and the rest of the region either has open relations or secret relations. It's only Iran that opposes the Israeli regime because it is an apartheid regime. Iran's policy towards Israel is identical to Iran's policy towards apartheid South Africa. So the animosity stems from the Iranians being very robust in declaring the illegitimacy of the apartheid project and the colonization of Palestinian land. And the Israeli regime wants Iran, and the United States wants to hold Iran back. The nuclear program is peaceful. The International Atomic Energy Agency has never said there has been anything military angle to this program, but the Israelis and the Americans are using the Iranian nuclear program as an excuse to put pressure on Iran and to isolate the country. But the Israelis and the Americans, by targeting Iranian scientists, whether under Obama, where 4 were murdered, or now where 1 was recently murdered, they are carrying out acts of terrorism. And the Western media is justifying this by creating this narrative that this scientist was in charge of producing a nuclear weapon, whereas the IAEA has never said any such thing.
Why has the West been so quiet when it comes to condemning this murder?
Well, there are a couple of problems here. One is that since the Western media still dominates in much of the world, the international community basically gets their information from Western sources. And Western sources are utterly dishonest. They, as soon as this scientist was murdered, they tried to justify this terrorist attack by implying that he was the head of a nuclear weapons program, which was a lie. Iran, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has never accepted such a claim. They've never made such a claim themselves. And in fact, Iran is implementing the additional protocol right now, which allows the IAEA to have exceptional access to Iran's nuclear program. And by the fact that the EU did not condemn this attack, they did not condemn this act of terror, they did not use the word condemnation or condemn, they are in fact whitewashing the Israeli regime's actions. They are giving a green light to murder. And the same is true with other Western countries. So Western regimes are supporting terrorism. The United States, of course, gave an openly green light through Trump's retweets and through what we saw in the New York Times and statements made by US officials. Much of the rest of the international community that knows what's going on, powerful and independent states, they've condemned this. But the United States and Europeans consider themselves to be the international community. That's the real problem. And some of their proxies in our region, they abide by their dictates. So there's not really much that we can expect.
Given the lack of condemnation, is there an expectation now that Israel will get away with it?
Well, that's exactly why Iran will not negotiate its missile defense capability, its drone defense capability, or its regional alliances. If they knew that Iran was defenseless, they would be attacking Iran relentlessly. And the Israelis and the Americans would constantly be harassing Iranian ships, Iranian planes, Iranian civilians. Therefore, the Iranians know quite well that the only thing that prevents such attacks is Iranian strength. And I believe that since the international community is unable to defend the non-Western countries from Western imperialism and Western aggression, and the Israeli regime is a projection of the Western empire, that we have to do it ourselves. And Iran will respond as a result. Iran has already responded in parliament by decreasing cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency and also expanding the nuclear program. That is the punishment for the United States and the Europeans for supporting such behavior by the Israeli regime. And there will also be a lethal response to the Israeli regime. There's no doubt about that, because the Israeli regime has to be forced to recognize that they will pay a price for aggression.
A clever man, that. Dr. Yasmin, although, of course, loyal to your original country of Iran, you're not a supporter of the political system there. It's fair to say that. What do you think the impact on politics in Iran will be of, I'm sorry to put it this way, the apparent ease with which Israel can murder extremely important people inside the Islamic Republic? If I were a voter in Iran, I'd be looking for, in the elections next year, a government that was going to be a bit stronger, a bit more capable of defending our vital interests. What do you think the impact will be?
I think a lot of people have a lot of economic problems, serious economic problems, and therefore that wouldn't be their top priority. But remember that this decision isn't just one faction of the government, if you like, the Rouhani government. It is a general decision by the entire regime, by the supreme leader himself, I presume, not to retaliate at this moment. And there are very good reasons for it. In my opinion, in the last weeks of the Trump administration, he still is determined to draw Iran into a local war so that Israel can expand. And this is beyond Iran. Then Israel can take over more land, take over the West Bank with the plans that it had and was slowed down in July, but also for Israel to wage a war against Iran. So the decision not to retaliate at this moment, I don't think was by one part or one faction of the government. It was a general decision supported most probably also by Revolutionary Guard, because no one wants a war, especially when you know that the person who is initiating, who's trying to get you to do this war, has been after regime change his style, Trump style, with some of the most idiotic people in the world to replace the Islamic Republic. That's a dream that would not happen, because people in Iran look at regime change in Syria, look at regime change in Iraq, look at the history of the war in Afghanistan and say, we might not like, some of the young people don't like the clerical regime. I think the regime would agree with me that quite a number of young people don't like the government. But they look around them and they don't want the kind of war that would lead to regime change in the way Trump wants it. Not just because the candidates for regime change are disreputable, corrupt, and absolute terrible groups and individuals, but also because of the region, because of what people see in the region. So not going to war, I think, was popular. You are right that there will be retaliations against the Rouhani government, but I would say that's more to do, if there is a loss of election in the next presidential election, it will partly be because the government has been incapable of deliver economic prosperity that was promised with the American deal. And people will say, can we trust another US president when a deal that was sealed and signed in 2016 was denied, 2015 was denied by Trump administration?
Ali, that's a powerful point, isn't it? What would be the point of sitting down with the incoming President Biden? Haven't the Americans proved that you can't do business with them, whoever's in office?
Well, to be honest, my own judgment and my personal opinion, I think that goes across lots of politicians and political activists in the Middle East, that you can't trust Americans. Americans seek their own interest, and they're having problem with Iran today, a multi-dimensional problem. Iran, who seek Iranian interest and act strongly to protect its own independency and its own people, and did not surrender since the revolution by Imam Khomeini. did not give up, although there is a severe restrictions and sanctions in Iran for around now 41 years. That's one problem. And the other problem with Iran is a growing power, whether they like it or no. And they can't go in a clash with Iran directly. Americans, they want a proxy to go in a clash with Iran. They wanted Saudi somehow to go because they wanted to make it a Shia-Sunni war somehow. And they tried to spark it in Bahrain and other areas, Lebanon and Iraq, but Iran did not respond. They're smart enough.
They're not a great military power, Saudi Arabia, as 5 years of utter failure in Yemen.
Yeah, but if a war started between Iran and Saudi, American will come and say, look, we are here to protect the interest, and they will have a reason, a legitimate reason to attack Iran. And Iran is smart enough not to go there. So the problem is quite big for Americans, and I think Iranians will retaliate. They will not stay silent, because what happened, the assassination of Dr. Fakhrizadeh, in my opinion, politically, is more pressing on Iranian than the assassination of the General Soleimani, because this has happened on the soil of Iran, and that happened in Iraq. That's one reason. And the second reason is the act is to terrorize the Iranian scientists. They've never terrorized, they've never submit to the American demand, but if they did not retaliate, protect their own scientists, at a point of time, Iranian scientists will seek another area in the world like Arabs. They went to America, Britain, and other areas to work. So I think there will be a retaliation at a time that Iran think it will, have a better result than what the American and Israeli want.
Brother Musharraf, how is it that Iran cannot protect its people, its key people, better? Rather than retaliation, I'd settle for, let's make sure they can't kill any more of our scientists.
Yeah, well, George, I would like to mention that killing of Fakhrizadeh is not in just killing a scientist. It's much more than that. The Israelis have given a message to the public in Iran also that your security forces, they have failed to protect a scientist of that caliber who was under threat for years. It was not something that was not under threat. He was under threat.
Netanyahu threatened them publicly by name at least 3 years
for
ago.
years. For years. He was in the picture for years. So the security forces, the confidence of the Iranian public on the security forces and the apparatus which is working for the security, they also wanted to shatter that and encourage those who are anti-government people to come up, and there is some space for them, and create a confusion in those areas also. That's one point. So secondly, the scientist, eliminating a scientist of that caliber is something very serious. He was of a very high prestige and high honor, like the killing of Qasim Soleimani sometimes back, and now this one. In Afghanistan, if we see that when Americans were on the brink of coming, before that there was the martyrdom of Ahmad Shah Massoud there. So here also the situation is not very simple, and Iran don't have an option not to retaliate. But retaliation in what sense and at what time? If they don't retaliate, they have to move 2 more steps back, which Iran don't have that space to move back now. I think they're smart enough, they will choose it at their own, not before, because at this moment, Trump was of the idea, and the Israeli regime is of the idea that Biden will try to make good terms with Iran. So if there is a war before that, so Biden will not be able to create that situation.
Try to box him in. Now, Paul Ingram is a campaigner here in Britain against nuclear weapons.
Good to be here, George. Thank you for having me.
Can a state simply assassinate scientists from other nations?
Well, so I think that question can be divided into two. They physically can. Scientists have been killed. It is quite clear that either the Israelis or the United States have been assassinating scientists within Iran. There's no question about the actual act itself. Should they be able to? Absolutely not. We used to have an international norm almost universally accepted against assassinations of any kind, particularly political leaders and others. But I think that norm has been eroded over the last few years. And we've seen the United States using drone attacks and other technologies to engage in targeted killings. The Israelis have been engaged in assassination of political leaders for some time. I think ever since the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, which was possibly one of the most successful assassinations we've ever seen, in the sense that the extreme right-wing lone assassin managed to derail the peace process, and the region has been suffering ever since. I think Israelis notice that success and feel that whatever the morality, they seem to feel a license to be able to kill individuals if they choose to, if they have a particular interest to do so. Whether it be to put back nuclear programs, or whether it be to send a political signal, or actually most likely and most common to disrupt smooth running political processes, peace processes, or trigger some sort of hostile reaction that can disrupt any otherwise peaceful operations.
Is there any international law that provides protection for scientists?
Well, so there's not a specific international law that protects scientists, but of course, you know, there is international law against one country operating with impunity to kill and assassinate anybody.
So in your view, why does Israel target scientists?
I think the reason why they target scientists is because it reinforces the narrative that they have, that the scientists, the individuals concerned in these research projects, are engaged in projects that are designed to develop weapons that are destabilizing or undermine the peace. So whether that's true or not, whether any particular individual scientist is in fact engaged in, say, nuclear weapons research, that is the narrative that they push within Israel, the United States, Europe, and other places. And killing an individual that they accuse of being involved in this sort of research reinforces that narrative in the minds of the target audience. So, for example, there's been much less condemnation of this assassination within the United States, within Europe, because the suspicion is cultivated and strengthened by those narratives that this individual or these individuals are involved in developing nuclear weapons for Iran. And no amount of condemnation that this is double standards or that these individuals were not actually involved in these projects can dent that sort of narrative. In fact, you know, the moment you start saying, well, this person was not involved in nuclear weapons research, you're taking away from the point that these countries are involved in, frankly, outrageous assassination techniques.
Will the deafening silence around the world in condemnation, or the lack of it, give Israel further license to kill?
Yes, I think absolutely. I think the fact that the international community has been muted in its condemnation of this activity does give license to future Israeli actions in this way. It's really difficult for countries that are seen as or labelled as aggressive or contrary to the international community to condemn this sort of activity or to retaliate without this being seen as further provocation. The fact that those states, particularly European states, have been relatively quiet on this because I guess they are they hold back on criticizing Israel because of the fear of being accused of anti-Semitism or the fear of losing a close relationship with the United States or suffering condemnation in response.
Ali, this must be a nervous time for, I don't mean to insult them, let me just call them small allies in the Persian Gulf of the United States. Now Israel also allies of Israel now, because of course the most obvious place for retaliation is in the Gulf. It's in the waters of the Gulf, or maybe even on the territory of Gulf states. Nervous? Much?
Well, I think the problem is Iran wanted always to have a peaceful relation between its neighbor. And they have given many chances to this government, but this government is a product of the, imperialism. They don't seek their own interest. They don't make decision on their own. Rather, they take orders and act. Having Israel, the Zionist entity, in the picture now, in the Gulf, make this country a target for Iran. It's very simple. Now, we have seen Yemenis targeting Saudi at the time of Benjamin Netanyahu meeting with Mohammed bin Salman. And my personal opinion, that was a message. And that's why Benjamin Netanyahu canceled his meeting in Abu Dhabi and Manama, which should happen a week ago. Now, I think Iranian, until today, they wanted a peaceful relation. But the problem is these government, they don't listen and they go blindly with Israel and American. At a point of time, there will be a clash. There will be a clash. And my advice to this government is to stay away as much as possible from this clash, because it will be a destroying war for this government in particular if they act and continue acting on behalf of Israel and United States.
Well, Yasmin, when General Soleimani was killed, assassinated, and there was an exchange of fire, limited as it was, between the US and Iran, Iranian spokesmen were very clear that any ally of the United States which is allowing its air, water or land to be used for attacks on Iran immediately become a legitimate target. And places like Dubai were mentioned. These are sitting ducks. They have no means of defending themselves, yet they take terrifying risks to be allies of the US. Why?
It is partly their colonial past, the fact that they're now part of an imperialist system. But there is also the fact that financially they are torn. On the one hand, many of these countries have close financial relations with Iran and Iranians inside Iran. And they're affected, for example, some of them, their economies were affected by the sanctions, because sanctions meant there was less investment, less building, less work in...
That's obvious in the UAE and Oman, for example.
Yeah, and yet they haven't even learned from that basic example that weakening Iran weakens them in some ways. I think it's still the power of the United States, but also its allies, Saudi Arabia, as one of the main countries of that region, that part of the Middle East, as the main powers that can dictate what's happening in United Arab Emirates, despite economic interests that are against that, political interests that are against that. I wouldn't dismiss everyone in the Gulf. My understanding is that on the street, as they say, Palestinians still have the vote of the ordinary citizens of many of these countries. The fact that Kuwait didn't go and oppose this is a good example that even with the limited, very limited, if you like, access to popular vote or popular opinions that exist in Kuwait, completely limited, but the fact that Kuwait didn't go and opposed the Saudi-Israeli alliance is a sign that as soon as you go into the street in these countries, alliances with the Zionist entity is not acceptable to ordinary people.
A very good point on which to end. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalima Horra on Mayadeen Television. Thank you for watching.